The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Glory to you, Lord. As Jesus continued his journey to Jerusalem, he traveled through Samaria and Galilee, and as he entered a village, 10 persons with leprosy met him. They stood at a distance from him and raised their voices, saying, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." And when Jesus saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." As they were going, they were cleansed. One of them realized he had been healed, returned, glorifying God in a loud voice. He fell at the feet of Jesus and thanked him. He was a Samaritan. Jesus said in reply, 10 were cleansed, were they not? Where are the other 9? Has none but this foreigner returned to give thanks to God? Then he said to him, "Stand up and go. Your faith has saved you." The Gospel of the Lord. Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you. Well, I'm thankful for you. You showed up today. And I'm sure all of you came because you have something in mind that you want to give God thanks for. It might be a very particular and specific thing, or it might be just everything in general. Maybe just a couple anecdotes, really. Pardon me. About that first Thanksgiving. I'm not sure what image most people have, but it wasn't really a big raging party. There was no mashed potatoes. There was no dressing, and there wasn't any cranberries. Now paint the picture. It's 1621, and I don't know the dates, but I don't know the time frame, how long the colonists from England had landed already. I'm sure it wasn't in the first 15 minutes. There might have been a couple seasons. So we call them colonists because they formed a colony of the new, well, today we'd call them immigrants, right? So the immigrants, colonists, were received at this Thanksgiving by the natives. Now, if I vaguely can say this name correctly, Wampanoag Indian tribe, of which there were about 45,000. Big number, right? And they'd lived there a long time. So the colonist immigrants, the white people, and the native Indians. So the immigrants, colonists, are new to the land, and they're trying to survive. It was hard. A significant number of them died from exposure and a lack of nutrition in those first years. And in a certain way, they were dependent on the Indians who knew the land. Obviously, I would think they knew how to hunt, but they're in a new land, and they need to find, okay, what's to be found to hunt and shoot and consume. And the Indians were new to them and would soon become would-be enemies. But at least at this early time, they were seasoned and known to the land. And so you had this bit of an integration of new peoples to each other. Beautiful image, right? And it was. That was the first time in 1621. A couple years later, 1623, It had a little more of a religious tone. They came and played ball games. I don't know what kind of ball it was. I don't think it was baseball. But they played ball games, and they had songs and dancing, and prayers were said at Plymouth. There was a mayor of Plymouth, and there was the chief of the Wampanoag, I think, the chief of the tribe, and they gathered, and they prayed, and they shared a meal. You may have read, because you can look it up on the internet pretty quickly, the main dishes were venison and duck and fish. Sounds pretty good, right? No turkey. They had onions and squash, corn, and pumpkins. No pumpkin pie. Because they did not yet have cows or milk, and they couldn't make butter, and they didn't have flour yet. Probably historically and generationally, even let's say back to the time of Jesus, that first Thanksgiving could have been called a fall harvest celebration. It was in the fall when the crops were harvested. So the Indians at that point had learned how, to do agriculture and plant, particularly corn. But it wouldn't have looked anything like we know Thanksgiving today. And it wasn't, and then I don't know the time frame, but within some years, not many, I don't suppose, a full third of the Indians died from yellow fever, brought to America by the Europeans, the colonists, and others who began to travel to the Americas. To this day, there remains about 4,000 to 5,000 Indians of this tribe that still live today in New England. It was Abraham Lincoln in 1863, at the conclusion of the Civil War, and shortly after the time he gave the Gettysburg Address, that he made Thanksgiving a national holiday. And it came to be what we know it is pretty much today. I believe the woman's name was Sarah Hale, Hale, and it was she that somehow brought forth the idea for turkey. So that's where turkey came from, and mashed potatoes and all the rest. And I know all kinds of things are eaten, like macaroni, and other things are used at Thanksgiving. So have at it. Now, there's something interesting there, isn't there? As a country and as a land. And I mean this in the positivest of ways. But we became a land that was formerly belonging to others who were a nation of themselves. 45,000 people is a nation. And we, as colonists, immigrants, came, and before too long, well before 1863, the Indians became enemies. The thought just comes to mind, in a lot of ways, and I don't mean this in a particularly negative way, we're still learning how to be a human race. You know what I mean? Just think about it. In terms of the eons of time, if let's say this is the timeline of life and civilization, we're about right here, literally. So we're still learning how to be a human race. But look at the groundwork. They gathered for a meal. At least in the beginning. And I think there's a great deal to do here with Thanksgiving. For what things are we most grateful? Mostly for the things that we can't do for ourselves, and those for whom we are dependent to help us with the things we ourselves don't have and can't do for ourselves. That's why Thanksgiving and gratitude is so important. I don't know exactly, but I'd be willing to suggest that the Indians helped the immigrants and the colonists survive. And then before too long, they became enemies and they pretty much disappeared. You know the Indian history of our country, not a pretty picture. But still, it was a good beginning. The lectionary typically offers these same readings each year, although there are several other options. So if I can think of a couple, what are some other meals of Thanksgiving that Jesus shared? I can recall broadly that in Matthew's Gospel, when or after Jesus called Matthew, the tax collector, he and the disciples went to Matthew's house, and I suspect they had a pretty nice spread there, because Matthew was wealthy and he could afford whatever he wanted to get for his new friend or friends. I can think of the meal where the woman of the town crashed the party at Simon's house, and the Pharisees were there, and they were feigning hospitality to Jesus. And the woman came uninvited and washed his feet with her hair, with her tears, and dried them with her hair. Awkward. But it was a meal. And probably most importantly, have you ever thought of the Last Supper as a Thanksgiving meal? Which is exactly what it is. Because the word Eucharist has its roots in thanksgiving. So who's giving thanks? I don't think the disciples are, because they're in awkward anxiety, anticipating or thinking about or perceiving the death of Jesus. So it's Jesus himself who is thankful. He's thanking the Father, that the Father honors him, the Son, as the Redeemer of the human race. And you'd have to suggest that Jesus is very grateful for the first believers, the disciples, and that wider crowd that saw him and believed in him and realized his power. Maybe even, don't know, maybe even the Samaritan was there. Because Jesus is really at the end of his public ministry. His public ministry is really finished at this point. So this person's already been healed of his leprosy. Now, again, that's a whole different reflection, but what happened to the other 9? Does it take a whole lot of conscious effort to be grateful, to be thankful? Shouldn't, really. We're all dependent on each other, and if we don't think we're dependent, wake up and smell the coffee. Because we can't become ourselves by ourselves. I made the comment at the book group yesterday, Father Ed Ferrer, God bless him. He used to say quite frequently, and wrote in many of his books, "My neighbor is my unknown self." And we're thankful when others give us, in our dependence, things that we can't give or do for ourselves. Why did the Samaritan come back? Culturally, he was a Samaritan, and the other 9 were the other 8. Were there 10 or 9? How many were there? 10. So the other 9 were Jews. And Jesus told them to go to the temple, so they did. They were following what they were told, and they did the church thing, got their certificate of purification, thinking, okay, I got it now. I think that's a big reason. The Samaritan wasn't preoccupied with the temple because they wouldn't let him in anyways. So he was free, I suppose, of the ways of religion. It touched his heart. He knew there was a power greater than himself that came from the man who told him to go to the temple and on the way was cleansed. He realized that Jesus did him that favor, that Jesus desired to do it, he had the will to do it, and he had the power to do it. And it totally changed his life. It gave them the freedom to go back into community, to be accepted, to have a sense of belonging and value among others. Critical movements of what it means to be human. Would you be surprised if he were at the Last Supper? I wouldn't. He'd be grateful, and he might understand as much or more than the others what was going on there. As I began, I'm sure many of you already have very particular things in mind, and that's good. I am very grateful for you, because if you weren't here, well, neither would I. I'm grateful for your goodness. It's hard to imagine that I've been here almost 20 years. You might be thinking, yeah, we know. I see your goodness. 25 baskets, 23, whatever it is. $1,600 or so people gave in cash. I drove up, a couple of us drove up to Port Huron the other day, wasn't yesterday, to take a basket up there for kind of an outreach of a person that we know that 2 or 3 generations of a family living in one house, and there's mental health issues, and we've been giving them a basket for some years. And the youngest is a 10-year-old girl, and they were so grateful. And the mom of the girl said, well, I finally got a car. So if there's anything I can do for you, I want to be able to give back. She doesn't have the money to drive from there to here, but she wanted to give back. I'm grateful for your generosity. I'm grateful for your relationships with one another. I know there's a lot of family connections, marriages between many of our parishioners. I think it's a pretty healthy Christian community. Not perfect. Nobody's perfect. Go ahead, get a big head. You're a good Christian community. So think about that for which you're grateful. Obvious things: life, love, health, family, friends, faith. I'm grateful for medical devices and medicine. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. I'd be kind of stiff. We're all grateful for different things. So when you have your meal today, whether there's 2 there, I hope there's more than 1. If there's only 2 or 3 or 4 of you, or if there's 20 or 30 or 35 or 50, that's probably going to happen somewhere, be sure and say a prayer. Be sure and be mindful that you're a community of a family. Because Thanksgiving is about relationship. And it's about being fed. And the greatest food is the food of love. Because that's what the Eucharist is. I know, somebody will get on your nerves. Maybe the turkey will be a little overdone. Maybe the cranberries will be spilled. And maybe the green jello will be left in the fridge one more time because it was forgotten. But be sure and say a blessing. If it's not the habit of the family to say a blessing, take the risk and say a blessing. And maybe, no, don't start going around the table if there's 50, because the food will be cold by the time you're done. And maybe give one example of why you're grateful. And if all you can do, because it's too awkward, then just say the Bless us, O Lord prayer. Because it'll matter. It'll make a difference. Because we're still learning how to be a human race. Sounds odd, right? It's increasingly difficult with technology and phones today, especially for the young, to know what belonging and community and connection means. Those who are a little older, everybody here, we know what that means because we've been through a lot. So we have to be the example. so that those who are growing up from the age of 2 or 3 with technology, somebody's got to teach them how to be in relationship, connected, and belonging. May God be praised. May God be praised for all God has given us. And may we be thankful for all that we are and can be for one another. Thanks be to God.